Hi, my name's Jeff Scott of Oracle Solutions. You're on the article explaining what priority risk assessments are. I wanted to explain in a little bit more layman's terms because the article can be a little bit complicated. So there are two risk assessments that need to be undertaken when you do a risk assessment on asbestos. One is the material risk assessment, which if you go to our article on material risk assessments explained, you will understand what they are. And basically the material risk assessment is the likelihood that the material will release fibre. The priority risk assessment is another assessment which, when you put it together with the material risk assessment, gives you the whole risk assessment of the asbestos product that you're looking at. Now, priority risk assessments are a little bit more complicated than material risk assessments and take into factors more things than the material risk assessments do. And if you look at the article, you'll see that that's all divided down and it's all explained. So what I'd like to do is give you a bit of a brief outline of why you need a priority risk assessment and what they're actually for and how you do them. So if you imagine that you've done a material risk assessment and you have done a material risk assessment on, let's say, pipe insulation in a cupboard in a school. Now, the pipe insulation is in a really poor condition. It's really friable. It's releasing asbestos, and it is in a really bad way. Now, on the material assessment, that will give it a really high risk. So what it will say to you is that is a high risk asbestos material. Now, what you have to take into consideration is what is the likelihood that someone is going to be exposed to the asbestos from that pipe insulation. So if I was to now turn around to you and say that that cupboard in that school is permanently locked, it's sealed, no one ever goes in there, and it will never ever be accessed for maintenance or any routine other works, all of a sudden you can see that if the room is sealed, the asbestos risk is actually reduced because no one is ever going into that room. So all of a sudden, when you do the priority risk assessment, when you look at all of your other asbestos products in that school, that particular item may well come down the list on what you need to do. So the prioritization of what works you need to do and what things you need to do to reduce the risk from asbestos, that particular item may fall right the way down the list because the actual risk of the potential of somebody becoming exposed to the asbestos is majorly reduced. And that really is what the priority risk assessment is there for. It's looking at the material, so the material risk assessment, but then it's making an assessment as to what is going to actually happen in and around that area where the asbestos is. So the priority risk assessment, there are various factors, and again, there is an algorithm which is used to produce the assessment score, but there are four main questions, and those are the normal occupant activity within the area, the likelihood of disturbance, the human exposure potential, and the maintenance activity within that area. Now, each one of those questions has got various other questions inside of those. And the idea of the priority risk assessment is that you look at each individual question. You can see in the article that we've divided those down for you so you can see what they are. And what you do is you take the average score. Now, a little bit like the material assessment, it's a score that can be anywhere from 0 or right the way through to 12. So when you add two of the scores together, the material risk assessments, which can be a score anywhere from 2 to 12, and the priority assessments, which can be a score from anywhere from 0, 2 all the way up to 12, the total score for your whole asbestos risk assessment is out of 24. Now, the higher the score, the higher it is to 24, the higher that the risk is from that asbestos product. But what you're taking into consideration is not just whether it will release fibre, it's whether or not there is going to be people around that are going to get exposed to that asbestos. So when you put together your asbestos management plan and you start putting all of the priority risk assessments in order, what it can do for you is it can highlight which bits of work you need to do very urgently and which bits can potentially wait a longer time or in some cases may never need to be undertaken. So if I go back to the cupboard, the asbestos within that cupboard, if it's fully sealed, locked, and no one's ever going to go in there, then it doesn't really pose a risk to anybody unless somebody were to go in there. So from a priority risk assessment point of view, it's a very, very low risk. And if you look at that with the material risk assessment, it means that it will probably jump far down the list as opposed to some of the other asbestos that you may have. Now, if you was to take the opposite, of course, and you was to say, look at a low material risk assessment, say something like vinyl floor tiles, they would come up with a very low material risk assessment because the vinyl floor tiles are very unlikely to release fibre. If they're in a relatively good condition, then it will come out as a very low risk. So when you're doing your asbestos management plan and you're looking at your action plan or all the steps that you're going to do to manage your asbestos, if you just look at the material assessment, then the asbestos floor tiles will come very low down the list. Now, if I was to turn around to you and say, well, those floor tiles are in a school, they're in a classroom that has a lot of foot traffic, they're slightly damaged, and the chances are that because of all the foot traffic, they're going to continually be damaged again and again and again. When you look at the priority assessment will actually say that they're a high risk because there's a high risk of human exposure to asbestos fibre because they're continually in a place where they might get damaged. So as you can see, when you add the two assessments together, you might have a very high material assessment, which actually has got a low priority rating, but you might have a very low material assessment that has a high priority rating. And this is why you need to do both assessments and put them together so that you can prepare your plan and you can actually act in the right way. Make sure that your action plan is being undertaken in a way that manages the risk as far as you reasonably can to ensure that nobody is exposed to asbestos. I hope that's explained a little bit about priority risk assessments. Like I say, if you was to read the article, you can see that everything's in there, all of the details. And if you go back to our material risk assessment, you can see that all the details in there also. Hopefully this has been of help. If you do need any information on this, feel free to call a member of the team and we'll be happy to sit and explain it in a lot more detail, and we'd be happy to help you do your material risk assessments if they've not been done already, and definitely we'll be able to help you with your priority risk assessments. It's worthy of note that priority risk assessments should be undertaken by you because the questions that are asked on priority risk assessments generally can only be answered by you. So although we can help you put those together, they need to be led by yourself. Thank you.